Okay, welcome. This is my talk on sustainable content management systems. The title of the talk is, Do CMS Systems Contribute to or Detract from Web Sustainability? And my name is Pete Markowitz, and I am developing this for the Sustainable UX Conference, which is going to happen on February 11th. And this is a summary of what I'll say at the conference, so you can look at it later, or if there's a problem connecting, this will contain equivalent information. And so I'm going to move to my slideshow and start that right away. So just going in here, I'm going to grab my share, and there's my slide. So as you can see, it says Sustainable UX, and it's about CMS systems and their impact on sustainability. And if we go look through here, here's some information about me. I worked as a research scientist for many years, and then I got into the web in the 90s, like a lot of people. I was involved in founding one of the early internet music download services. We also did art. It's called IndieSpace, and it's still around today, and our update was April 1994, so I've had a lot of experience historically with this. I've co-authored books on the internet, also on US generations, and I became interested in web sustainability from a designer and developer perspective around the year 2011. So what does this talk about? Well, we're going to talk about why content management systems should be analyzed for sustainability. I'm going to introduce the idea of what, if we're talking about sustainable or green design for the web, what does that look like? And what would a sustainability framework for the web actually be like compared to, let's say, green design and industrial design or architecture? I'm going to identify specifically with respect to content management systems, what parts are more or less sustainable than their alternatives, and then finally I'm going to use a strategy which I call a green ingredient strategy, and I borrowed that from the chemical industry, to create documentation for the sustainability of projects that involve web design using content management systems. So for the purposes of the talk, I should probably say, what is a content management system? Content management systems allow non-developers to add content via web-based visual frameworks. So people who are not programmers can develop websites. That's basically what they do. They also provide a system for organizing and controlling the information on a website in a hierarchical fashion. So I can create information architecture and taxonomies that make big, complicated sites with a lot of information easier to understand. And they also typically will enable the installation of custom themes, and those themes allow me to change the website's design. They use 3 technology layers, typically client-side templates that give them a look or feel. They have a database on the server, and that's where the information is stored. And then usually there is a programming language that links the database to the front-end UI. Now, by these criteria, I would say WordPress and Drupal fall in what I'm calling a CMS. On the other hand, Google Docs, even though it does some of these things, and so does Django, which is a framework for developing CMSs, they are not themselves CMS systems. So what's our motivation? Why would we worry about CMS systems? Well, the reason is that CMS systems rule the professional and amateur web, and they are now the dominant method that people use to construct websites. So if you look at this slide that shows some stuff about market share, you can see that WordPress itself, all by itself, it is half of the web. Pretty incredible. And you know, a few years ago, it was like 25–30%, and it's actually risen from that time. And if we look, the other 2 CMS systems that are used are Drupal and Joomla, and collectively they give us around 15% or so. And then everything else out there, including all the other CMSs, is only about 40% of the web. So clearly, a couple of open source CMS systems dominate the way people do web design and development today. It's even more interesting when you look at websites with high traffic. And I took some data here on the top 1,000,000 websites, which means they're the ones that have some traffic. And in that case, WordPress is still incredibly dominant. Once again, it looks like an enormous value here, as you can see in this chart. And then Joomla and Drupal are about at the same relative level, maybe about 15 or 20% of the market. And when people are asked, well, why are they using WordPress for these things, they typically cite the plugin and themes which allow them to quickly develop websites on the fly. This is also true of the vertical market. So in the vertical market, where people are building things like intranets or internal work management systems, WordPress is still dominant, even though it's not probably the best in other ways for such a thing. And so you can see that things like Drupal do show up. We do start to see some of the proprietary CMS systems, like, for example, Adobe's CMS. But once again, we have a few open source systems dominating this environment. Now, why even worry about something like Drupal? Well, the reason is that Drupal, even though it has relatively low installation numbers compared to WordPress, actually has much higher traffic. And you can see in this chart that if you look at WordPress, there are a lot of WordPress sites with relatively low traffic. But if you look at Drupal, Drupal has a fewer number of websites, but there's a lot of traffic on those websites. And some extremely high traffic websites have been built with Drupal. So Drupal's sustainability becomes important just because it's used, in terms of actual traffic. Now, in the e-commerce area, that's about a few percent of the total web market and several percent of CMSs. And here we see the WordPress solution. WooCommerce is also there. But we're starting to see some of the other systems down there, like Magento is pretty common, and so is the IBM system, and then a few others in here. And so these are also relevant simply because they tend to be used for something that is important to the web, a purchase of products and services. So they also have to be considered. Now, there is one area of CMS that I'm not going to consider. And those are CMS systems built for so-called creatives that are trying to build websites, and they look specifically for someone who builds a CMS that is like an authoring environment they're familiar with, like Adobe Creative Suite. And so an example of that would be something like Squarespace, Cargo. There's a few other sites like this. And what they promise is a code-free world where you can design kind of the way you would design in something like Adobe Illustrator or InDesign. And then if you're in the more general public and you don't know those tools, there'd be things like Wix and Weebly appeal there. But what's remarkable to me is if you look at the total websites on the internet, all of those sort of designer-centric sites that promise I don't have to really know how the web works and I can just do something creative are only 0.7% of the market. They're tiny, and you wouldn't know it from their advertising, but they really are not a significant part. They're smaller than any of these other segments we're going to look at. So in this talk, I'm really not going to consider them just because they are actually not all that important. Okay, the next topic I want to go through is what do we mean by web sustainability? Because this talk is about the sustainable web. And the question is, well, what do we mean by sustainability? I mean, most people have an idea of what's green, that you don't create pollution and so on. And sometimes when we think about the web being sustainable, we think about the web being efficient. But what I'm going to argue in this talk is that web sustainability is more than a fast loading site. It's more than energy efficiency. Features that are not really quantitative, like how reusable the code is, how inclusive the design framework is, that so everyone can participate, how future-friendly it is, meaning the code's not going to go out of date in the future, are all part of sustainability for the web. And part of our goal here will be to analyze CMSs based on a broader criteria than just carbon footprints or energy efficiency, and look at broader measures of sustainability. Now, sustainable virtual design, which is what I call this, and that's also the name of my blog, considers these things. And first off, you think about the current needs that users, designers, and developers have in order to create for the web. The second area you think about is best practice. And you want to make sure that methods you use to create websites and host websites and manage websites and attract audiences to websites, when they're being used, they don't prevent you from doing the same thing in the future. In other words, it's a strategy so you make sure you don't degrade the internet in some way, so what you're doing now will not be available in the future. And a very general definition of sustainability is exactly that. That sustainability is making sure that what you're doing today will be possible in the future because you have not created the ecosystem. So CMSs are part of the ecosystem. We've seen that they're a major part of the virtual internet ecosystem. So the question is, how do they affect sustainability? Well, the first way is that they differ in the features they offer, and those features impact their sustainability. So how do they differ? They differ, first of all, in their ability to organize information, how they can label information, whether you can build a taxonomic tree of the information, how orderly that tree is, if you have to do little tricks to organize your information. And there's a lot of variance there. For example, Drupal is very good at that, WordPress probably less so. Another factor is how big the development community is, because that tells you whether or not you're going to have a system that runs in the future, because a big community means that there are a lot of people interested and they'll continue to work on it. A related feature would be whether or not you have open source or closed source, because closed source systems, usually proprietary, could just disappear any day, and open source systems will probably persist. Another feature of CMSs that's relevant is the extent to which they allow you to manipulate the client side. I mean, typically, traditionally, CMS systems have concerned themselves with the server side and organizing information. The front end and the view are often generated on the server. Now, modern CMS systems increasingly are allowing you to alter that view by using JavaScript and other methods on the client to do that, and the various CMSs differ in that. A very important feature would be caching. Sites that are built with CMS systems tend to be very complicated. They have a lot of assets, and because of that, you want to minimize downloads, and you want to make sure that people don't download the same content over and over again. So a caching system that runs within the CMS system, or the ability of the CMS to use a content delivery network, or CDN, is pretty important. Another feature would be, is it easy for beginners? Is it easy for a beginner to use it and have the on-ramp that lets them start to develop for the site? Can people who are not specialists or computer science majors use it? And related to that would be access to themes and plugins, so that you have access to other people's designs and abilities, and then you can find out how it works for you. The cost is important because some WordPress sites are pretty free. Some of them use a little bit of money, but then in the case of Drupal, the modules often cost a significant amount of money. The final feature I'm going to list here is support for web standards. And here, CMS systems tend not to do as well because CMS systems often have not completely been updated to HTML5. So let's talk a little bit about our development strategies and what we would do here with these three common CMSs, which would be WordPress, Drupal, and Joomla. Now, I'd say Drupal has pretty good taxonomy, and Joomla as well, but WordPress isn't as good because its origin is in a blogging platform, and it has things that were customized for that. They are all okay to weak on standards because none of them are fully updated in 2016 for HTML5, even though they're getting there. They all have pretty good communities, and they're all getting updated on a regular basis, and they all have good methods for caching. They do differ in learnability. WordPress is pretty easy to learn. It's pretty easy to put up a basic site, whereas Drupal, you have to do a lot of effort to put up even a basic site. And Joomla typically falls right in the middle. Finally, they differ in the ability to extend. WordPress has tens of thousands of themes to create visual design, and it has thousands and thousands of plugins for function. And even though they exist for Joomla and Drupal, it's a lot less. So a second way we can think of sustainability with the content management system is to compare them to something else. So the question is, if I'm not using a CMS, what am I using? And what people tend to do is they use these things that I'm calling a client-heavy framework. Those are the alternatives. And so the modern web, we really have two ways to do things. We really don't make static websites anymore. We either have a server-side framework where the server often is actually building the web pages, or we have a client-heavy framework where the server is pretty much just providing data, and the client, using JavaScript libraries, is assembling the page and is actually doing a lot of the logic of the system as well. So the server has been minimized, and examples of that would be frameworks like Ember or AngularJS. Now, if we compare these, we can see some differences as well that might impact sustainability. The popular CMSs are all built in PHP and use MySQL as their most commonly as their database. Whereas what we see with the client systems, they're less coupled to a particular database solution or server-side script, and they do most of their work with JavaScript locally. A CMS system tends to finish the page on the server, whereas in the client-heavy systems, you send down a basic page and use JavaScript to dynamically construct the page. Now, all these systems are similar in the sense that they can typically embed or concatenate or create greater efficiency with assets that are being downloaded, and all of them use AJAX or the Fetch API to grab material so you don't have to update the entire page. An issue, though, is that some of them do have weak standard support, and I would say out of them, Ember and Angular are pretty good. You can use cutting-edge HTML and cutting-edge JavaScript APIs, no problem, whereas with a lot of CMS systems, you're locked even in just HTML4, and it's difficult to even use HTML5 even today. So if that's the case, what happens when we compare the systems to each other? How do content management systems relate to each other, or compare to each other? And I think the biggest thing we can say here, because this is something that is only starting, people have not done a lot of these comparisons, is that Drupal is probably the fastest of the open source system, which implies it's probably the most efficient structurally. And if we look at this plot that I got, you can see some proprietary CMSs being used, like HubSpot. They're very fast, but they're only used by a very small percentage of the internet. On the other hand, we see Drupal, which is pretty common, and it's quite fast. And you compare it to WordPress, you see that all versions of WordPress are quite slow compared to Drupal. So if you want to build an efficient website, you probably want to do it in Drupal if that's your primary goal. Another place we can consider CMSs would be in workflow. And what this is, how does the design of the CMS affect the way I have to build my workflow? I mean, what type of team do I have to put together in order to use the content management system and create something for it? And so the issue here is that WordPress does enable agile workflow because it's a small system and it's blog-like. It's pretty easy for just one person to do everything or a small group. And it really is good at, because it's kind of a super blog, supporting loose collaborative design with a small group of people. And having those themes so you can swap them in allows you to do lots of design experiments without having to do a lot of coding. And the same thing goes for plugins. You can kind of finger paint functionality on a site, refine it, and perhaps even rebuild it later, but it allows you to do a lot of prototyping. So being able to do prototypes means that you can do a lot of rollback in design. In contrast, if you have a system like Drupal, it's a little bit more difficult to learn, and you can't really build a website without building an information design. And the result of that difficulty is that you do tend to split your team into server-side only developers, and they're distinct from your front-end developers, and the designers probably are distinct from them. So that compartmentalization or siloing causes a social disconnect, and that can push your workflow into a less sustainable waterfall model. And that waterfall model just gets worse. You know, if you go to a system like Django or Ruby on Rails, you're going to have a real split, and you're going to probably be working in lockstep, waiting for the server-side people to finish the projects. Now, even though WordPress is pretty good at that, now if we try to use it for a big project, like we might use Drupal or something like Ruby on Rails, it actually doesn't scale very well. And the very thing, the blog taxonomy layout, the way WordPress's database is designed, predefines a lot of structures that as you make the site more complicated, it hinders your ability to build the site. And just as an example, WordPress has a couple of ways to store taxonomies. One of them is terms, and then one is called taxonomies. And the problem you have is you can make several taxonomies describing your information in WordPress, but if you have terms in two taxonomies, they're actually the same term data-wise, but the interface will treat them as distinct. And that means when you make a complicated site, you're going to run into all sorts of surprises where you can't really build the data structures you want. Ultimately, that would enhance user experience, and you have to do kludges and workarounds, and it means that for really complicated sites, WordPress is not terribly maintainable. All right, well, what about access? And what I mean by access is how many people can build sites. So I'm thinking of it from a creative perspective. And when we think about that, having content management systems with a lot of themes and plugins really opens up the web, the way it was maybe in the very beginning, in the early 90s. I mean, in the early 90s, anyone could build a website. It was just some HTML. And then we were in an era where you had to be a professional to build it, and most people couldn't build them, or the alternatives were pretty terrible, if you remember GeoCities. But CMSs allow designers or non-designers with widely differing technical skills to set up websites. And this gives us inclusive design, but it's inclusive design on the creative side. It allows people to participate in the creative process rather than just the only people who can build websites are elites who have graduated with computer science degrees. Now, that is a good thing from sustainability. As we'll see, most sustainability models include inclusiveness. But there's some problems with it. Amateurization reduces sustainability because amateur design leads to bloatware, and that means you have a high carbon footprint website. And then the other problem is an amateur might build an insecure website, and that lowers the sustainability of the entire internet. It's making it more hackable or crackable. So we're contaminating the virtual ecosystem. So far we've covered why we care about CMS systems, and we've covered some features of CMS systems that would impact the notion of sustainability. And remember, sustainability is how do we make sure things we do now can be done in the future, and we don't degrade the virtual ecosystem. So the next question we're going to consider is measurements. And I call this measuring web sustainability beyond the carbon footprint, because people often think, that when I think about the web, it's just about how much electricity a web page uses, but I want to go beyond the carbon footprint and talk about other ways to measure sustainability on the web. So we need some rules that are unique to web sustainability. And we need them, they need to be practical. We need to be able to tell if I'm setting up a project, am I building something sustainable without having to do a lot of mathematical calculations or a detailed model of how I'm using resources and so on. And so in other industries, they have strategies for doing this when they can't do exact calculations. And a simple one that you often hear the consumers hear is reduce, reuse, and recycle. Now within businesses, you'll see they use things like the sustainability helix framework or cradle to cradle, which is popular. Some types of designers will use biomimicry as a model just because the theory is that living things are very efficient because they've evolved that way. And then within graphic design, there has been some effort to develop sustainable practices for graphic design and frameworks for figuring out if your design is sustainable, and that is now being extended to packaging design. Now, one feature of all these frameworks is that they mix quantitative and qualitative measures, so you can't just have a single number represent the sustainability. So in order to do this for the web, I looked at the work that Nate Shredoff has done, and Nate wrote a terrific book called Design is the Problem, and he took information from these various sustainability frameworks and he tried to develop a general set of rules or guidelines that you could use to develop sustainability frameworks outside of industrial design and architecture where they're normally applied. And so I have his sustainability guides here. And so just looking at them briefly, one of them is that you make meaningful products, you don't make fluff, and that means your websites are actually valuable. You don't put up a useless website just because it's vanity or something. Design rollback so that you can actually redesign the website or switch your designs based on things as you develop it to make it a more sustainable site. Sourcing renewable materials, like being able to use green web hosts in our case. Designing products that'll work in the future, and that would be future-friendly web design using standards or classic visual design techniques. You design with the user in mind, and in our case, that's user experience or UX. You have democratic access, which means you make sure everyone can get to the website. You want to make your websites modular because interchangeable parts improve sustainability. And you want to minimize energy consumptions, but notice it's only one of the features in the sustainability guideline list. And in our case, minimizing energy is very similar to web performance optimization. And then finally, you don't want to corrupt your system. And in our case, our system is the internet. And that means that you want to make sure your website is optimized to function correctly in the internet. And those are primarily falls into the category of search engine optimization or SEO. So in this next section, I'm going to talk about scoring content management systems relative to these sustainability guidelines. So the first one, meaningful products. Well, CMS systems let you put up sites and take them down really quickly. So it's practical to build sites and make sure they're worth something, and then when their worth is over, you just get rid of them. And so I think that's a great feature of CMS systems, and a good example would be landing pages that people build a lot in advertising. Sites can be made functional almost instantly by using plugins. So again, you'll actually get a website that's useful to people rather than building some sort of electric paper that could have been done better in another medium. Now, the next section we have is easy rollback of your design, and having themes and child themes inside CMS systems makes it very easy to try a design and replace it with another one and then revert it back. So we're really getting rollback, and that enables us to have workflows that are more agile and less waterfall or lockstep. The third category is how do we source renewable materials? And in that case, the fact that CMS systems, at least the major open source ones, are ubiquitous means that we're going to be able to use green hosts because they'll all support it, because pretty much every web host on earth supports Joomla, Drupal, and WordPress. And then another thing is the fact that these are sites of active development means that we have renewable code, meaning the code's getting updated. Now, a minus in this area is the fact that there are so many installations running, a lot of them run with obsolete code. And there's no mechanism for forcing people to update, and especially in the case of plugins. It's very common for people to be running with obsolete, inefficient plugins and things that screw up access to the website. Now, it's gotten better in terms of updates with the major CMS systems, but this is still a problem. The next part of the sustainability framework is future-friendly. And major CMS projects tend to have large development communities, and that means probably even 20 years from now, we'll have WordPress and people will be upgrading it and adding features. On the other hand, because these CMS systems were often developed in the early 2000s, which means they're 15 to 20 years old at this point, they haven't shifted very quickly, and a lot of them still run in HTML4, and they have not fully shifted to HTML5, so they're not as future-friendly as other methods, like let's say a client-heavy framework. Now, as far as user-centric design, you can find themes that support great user experience, and also the taxonomy that you can build in, or the information design, means you can make the information more accessible to the user, so that's good. The minus side is, because it's easy to put up a website, you get amateurs in, and people who don't even understand how the web works, that they think it's some sort of television, or they think they're making electric paper, will draw a website or try to make a TV show, and they're really misusing it at that point, and that's not user-centric design. Basically, their audience will be confused. Next section is democratic access. And I would say CMSs are pretty democratic compared to other design technologies, and I would say particularly client-heavy systems, because even though those are also open source, it's pretty easy to install and use them, whereas there's a real learning curve to using something like Angular, and most people, especially designers, are not going to do it. Now, WordPress is the most inclusive, and I would say Drupal and Joomla are a little bit less inclusive because you can't build the site without building a custom taxonomy, whereas in the case of WordPress, you can start with a blog information model and just go from there. Now, as far as modular design, the most important feature probably of CMS systems is their modularity. They have their interfaces or their visual layers, usually in themes, and they use plugins for functions, and that makes them very modular. Now, that part's great, but internally there's a problem. Internally, because the major systems are all using PHP, and PHP sort of mixes up with your HTML and CSS, it means you get really poor separation of information and presentation within the theme or within the plugin. And the plugins themselves often are messed up, and they can very easily have inappropriate interactions that naive designers or developers won't know about, and then you'll end up with a very inefficient website because your plugins are fighting each other. Now, as far as energy and efficiency, anytime you put code on a server, you're probably getting greener bits. I mean, one thing we know is that data centers have become more green, whereas your local utility probably is less green. And so if you compute on the server, there's a good chance that the actual amount of carbon burned for that computation is less than it was running on your laptop or your mobile. Now, out of efficiency, Drupal is the most efficient. When you test it in WPO or web performance, it always comes out the best of the big open source systems. And it's partially because you can make really efficient taxonomy, and there's some extensions that help. Whereas WordPress is pretty inefficient because it was really designed to be a blog, and shoehorning it into different models makes it less efficient in terms of how much energy it uses. So WordPress pages tend to be heavy. They often are bloatware. Now, the next area is supporting the virtual ecosystem. Now, with good SEO support, you can actually make sure your website fits into the internet appropriately. And CMS systems typically do have good SEO support. There's usually a route to put metadata in to the system and organize and tag and label all your data very efficiently, which wouldn't happen with either a client, with either just static HTML, or I might add, with many of the client-side JavaScript systems, they really don't think a lot about metadata in that way. They tend to be focused often on user interaction. CMSs also usually have pretty good social sharing. It's pretty easy to integrate your digital ecosystem, your local ecosystem of all your social network sites and your Instagram and your Tumblr and everything else with the website. On the other hand, because it is so easy, the bad guys get in. And bad guys can use easy to install plugins to do things like bulk email, to track you, to try to install malware, and so on. Okay, well, so far we've discussed what content management systems are, the principles of sustainability, and then we went on to considering content management systems in terms of what a sustainable web framework might be like. And so in the last section of the talk, I'm going to consider how we would actually do this in practice. So what I mean by this is, let's say I'm trying to develop a website or I have a project. How do I score sustainability? Because it may not be that practical to do carbon footprints for your website, particularly during development. So I'm proposing an idea that I borrowed from industrial design called the green ingredients model, and taking that as a framework for building a sustainable framework so that we can actually work with sustainability while we're developing websites using content management systems. And so we need to measure sustainability using qualitative factors. This is the most important thing, because carbon footprints are a single number, but they're only part of the story of sustainability when you look at other frameworks that people have used in other industries. So we need more than energy efficiency, because to do energy efficiency for real, you have to do something called an LCA, or a life cycle analysis model. And that means you have to calculate energy and outputs on every step of the thing you're building. And so here I show a little image of how you do it in manufacturing, where you're looking at everything being produced along the assembly line, the materials, distribution, and carbon emissions related to that whole process, which would also include recycling and use by consumers. And that's difficult. Now, people do build these LCA models, but as far as I know, no one's ever built one for the web. And the reason is that doing a carbon footprint for a website is pretty difficult. I mean, you have to think about the energy your office uses, your designers use just to live. You'd have to think about the time frame and how much energy is expended by how fast versus a slow design process. You have to think about maintenance after the website is complete. You would have to go and calculate performance for all the major browsers and mobiles versus desktops. And furthermore, you have to figure out the energy use by consumers accessing the website, and you'd have to know what is the efficiency of energy production of all the utilities. So that would be pretty tough. And then you'd have to be able to answer quantitatively issues of how easy is it to extend the model, the information model. And it's possible, but it's quite difficult. Same thing, a number for modularity would be difficult, not impossible, but hard. And then finally, you would have to talk about the value of the site to users and somehow score that value. Now, there are examples of that. Tim Berners-Lee, who created the web, has created a new project called the Web Index. And the Web Index actually tries to score the value of the web to people in different countries, and it breaks it down by country. But even though that is an intriguing idea, no one's ever actually integrated it, to my knowledge, into a web sustainability calculation. So I'm going to propose a simpler idea so that we can talk about CMSs in an intelligent way. And this is the green ingredients model. And the big thing it does is it allows us to talk qualitatively, yet get something down on paper to see if we're doing progress. So it allows qualitative scoring for software, user experience, interface, changes in our design workflow, design strategies, design techniques can all be included as a green ingredient. So I call this the Ouroboros strategy, after this eternal snake. And if you want to see a little bit more about this, I put up a link you can look at on my sustainablevirtualdesign.wordpress.com site, which describes some of this. But basically the strategy is this. You make a database, which could just be in a spreadsheet, and you list green ingredients, and those green ingredients would be all aspects of design and development. You would just break them down. And then what you do is you score the presence or absence of these in the project you're developing, and then you look for cases where you can substitute one thing for another. For example, in the case of WordPress, there might be two plugins, and they both are mailer plugins, but one of them uses old code, one of them uses new code. So if we swap in the new code, that's probably greener because it's more standards-based and more efficient than the old code. And so that would be a swap of a green ingredient. And finally, if you can quantify, if there's some way you can get a number, you do, but otherwise what you're listing is just how many swaps you do between non-green and green ingredients. And so if you were to set this up in your project, you make a table, you break out things like what framework you're using for your code, workflow, commenting, standards in your code, and then you talk about the various aspects of UX you apply to make the site more efficient for users to use, user interface that makes it easier for people to find things on the page. In terms of access to search engines, you talk about your SEO, you talk about performance and efficiency of the site, or WPO, and you list those all as green ingredients. And then you try to swap if you can, and you score your swaps just like up or down, or maybe a for state. If you have a number, you put it in. And then finally, once you've done this, if you have a way to score things quantitatively, for example, using something like web page test, you put it all along your green swaps to try to show overall progress and how it shows up in some measurable parameters. Now the advantages are you can do sustainability and you can talk about choices instead of calculations. And that way you can get the ball rolling. Your progress can be detailed in terms of what you do in your choices in design and development. And also, this strategy allows you to create deliverables that are easily understood because they aren't a bunch of numbers and people don't have to understand efficiency calculations. So for the last couple of slides in this talk, I've included a couple of things, 2 green ingredients. So this is an example of how you might set up a visual green ingredient matrix when you're trying to choose a content management system. And so I've listed a couple of content management systems, and I've listed whether or not they're green or not with just an up or down, a red arrow or a green arrow. And if there are numbers available, like let's say efficiency, I've listed them. For example, I have efficiency where WordPress is less efficient than Drupal. Those numbers are somewhat made up, but you can probably find those values. There are some that are purely qualitative, and that might be how well the CMS defines the roles of people who are working on the site if the site has multiple users. But that can certainly be done with just an up arrow or a down arrow. And then we look at things like SEO support, flexibility, how easy it is to update the design, how easy it is to update the information model, and how scalable it is. Now, the advantage of setting this up is when we look at this, we now have a pretty good idea which is the more sustainable choice just by looking at this chart and looking at those arrows and the patches of color. And then the final slide shows how we might set up the green ingredient matrix if we're actually in the process of building a site and we're swapping green ingredients. And so what you see at the very top of this matrix are some quantitative scores, in this case, the score you get from web page test, and also the score from ecograder.com, which incorporates efficiency and a couple of other parameters like what web host are you using. And those give numerical scores. So we score those, and then what we do is we list our green ingredients and we list the point at which we swap in the green ingredient for perhaps something less efficient. And then by laying these alongside, we can see if our strategy of using these green ingredients is actually improving things. And visually, you can show, well, here's what we do with workflow, and it ties the workflow and the design decisions to the final sustainability. Now, it isn't fully quantitative the way that an LCA, a lifecycle analysis would be, but it does get us somewhere. And in my mind, this is a really good way to initially introduce the topic or discussing sustainability if you had a project and we're trying to decide how you're going to incorporate this in a content management system. So that's basically it for the presentation. And to summarize, I'll just say that CMS systems are really important. And they're being used so much that they really do form a large part of any sustainable future web that is sustainable or a green web. They do have a lot of features which could be used to improve sustainability, and they differ among CMS systems. But in order to consider them, we're going to have to use a framework that goes beyond carbon footprints. And so I suggested that a strategy which is qualitative, like this green ingredient strategy, would let us assay CMS sustainability, and that would allow us to include both qualitative and quantitative and move on the path to eventually doing true calculations of the sustainability of the web. So that's basically the talk, and I'll leave you with that. And if you want to see this, there is a conference, Sustainable UX, where we're going to be talking about this in greater detail all day on Tuesday. And I encourage you to see if you can get in there. If not, send me a line, check my YouTube channel, or send me an email, and I'll be happy to talk to you about it. All right, bye now for now.